Just going to turn my brain on here now for a moment, if I may, just to keep me on track. Good evening, and straight off, I like to start with an admission, which is that this has elements of a guilty pleasure for me, really. I mean, if you think about it, I'm being asked to talk about myself, and I'm greeted and gifted with an audience to listen to me talk about myself. So thank you very much indeed for that. I do hope, however, that some perspectives might be offered that would allow for some fresh thinking in relation to the condition and how one can, if you can get your head around this phrase, that you can live well with dementia. And I think that's a very powerful phrase that needs to be thought about, because unfortunately a lot of people are frightened and afraid and feel awkward and won't talk to you about it. So this talk that I can give here is one that is not so much scientific or clinical, but up close and personal. I suppose the main feature of my particular experience with the disease is its two very distinct phases. Firstly, as a companion and carer of a very particular kind to my father, who died and suffered from the disease in the 1980s. And then, secondly, my own diagnosis in 2014, 25 years later, as a patient living with the disease myself, and how I'm adapting to live with that. So the first phase first, just a quick recap. My father was very busy in theatre in the 1980s. He was very successful in doing that. He was, in fact, a workaholic before the term was coined. And when he began to feel things were going wrong with his cognitive functioning, what he did was hide it. Not to tell his family, not to tell his colleagues, not to tell his friends, and certainly not to tell his GP. So he hid the symptoms for as long as he possibly could, and it turned out that he could do it for a very impressive period of time. I would be fairly confident that my father was in his middle stages of the disease, which is broken up into three rough stages: early, middle, and final stages. And by the time I caught up with him, I found when I went into his office to join him and to help him, because he seemed to be so distressed, that I found his colleagues, when they saw me in the office, I had been an actor at this stage, a freelance actor, and I was having a whale of a time. Very enjoyable. If you get the chance to do it, go off and be an actor, it's great. But I found myself very worried by my mother ringing me constantly and regularly, and I was away on tours and things like this, and she'd just be saying how bad the situation was with my father, how brittle he was, how tense he was, how stressed he was, how he was alienating the people he was working with. So I appeared into the office to kind of offer some help and see what could be done. And, well, simply put, I was lit on by every single one of his colleagues, every single person he was doing business with, who said the situation was absolutely critical. All these businesses, all these successes were about to be wiped out in some kind of scandalous collapse. So I joined in as best I could, and all that was left to me really was a situation where I suppose you could say I maneuvered him into positions where he would surrender control over to others who could take up the work. And so the work survived. But by the time this process was completed, my father was so advanced in his conditions that he had to be committed into care, because he refused to accept any suggestion that there was anything wrong with him. He refused to stay at home to get well. He kept insisting on going into work. He was getting more and more deluded until eventually, as I say, we had to commit him with the certification of 2 doctors into care in St. John of God's Hospital. And not very long after that, about 6 months after he had been admitted to St. John of God's Hospital, he was transferred to Bloomfield Nursing Home, where he died very peacefully and quietly after a slow illness. So At this time, while he was in the hospital and all the work of helping get out of his affairs, I had found that I needed to find some way in which I could work this out of my system, this terrible passage, which it was. It was a very difficult passage. And what I decided to do was to make contact with the Alzheimer's Society, see was there some help I could give. So I joined the committee, and all there was at that time was a voluntary committee. There was no professional staff. There was no regular or substantial funding of any kind available. There was, in fact, it was difficult to even have information about the disease at the time. But I joined the society then and worked on the committee for about 2 or 3 years, and we did get to the point of having a paid executive and the beginnings of some grant aid. So after that had been achieved, I decided I'd done my bit and that it was time for me to, leave the world of Alzheimer's. So it was 24 years later, after my father's death, that phase 2 started with Alzheimer's disease for me when I received my own diagnosis of Alzheimer's. It was after a particularly pressured and stressful work period in late 2013, and I had, with my wife's, Miriam's encouragement, gone for cognitive tests in the memory clinic in St. James's Hospital. The result was a diagnosis of probable early stages of early onset Alzheimer's disease, unquote. Something of a mouthful, really. The probable bit was the best bit, of course. The early stages and the early onset had a sort of softening effect, but the word Alzheimer's was there at the end, big, bad, and ugly. The beast had landed at my door this time. It took a while to absorb, yet in a strange but unfortunate way, it was actually a help. I worked out a mantra for myself: plan for the probable, work for the possible, and hope for the future. Plan for the probable, well, that's all the boring practical stuff. Get an enduring power of attorney, organise your finances and other affairs as best you can, redo your will. Important to attend to all of those issues, don't run away from them, and there's plenty of good advice available. The more comfortable we can make people feel to talk about the condition, the more this really helpful response to it will be acted on. Work for the possible, well, that's probably pertinent to this evening in particular, is about altering your lifestyle to best combat the advance of the condition. Concrete activity itself is always good. It counters the debilitating effects of passivity. So top of that list is ensure regular physical exercise. This wasn't hard for me, luckily, because I had been very active in sport in my school years and in college, and I was very lucky to have elected to take part in a minority sport, which was fencing. The great thing about a minority sport is it's not hard to get international representation in a minority sport. So Eamon Coughlin, you had a big tide of people to get ahead of. I was able to get the opportunity to fight with world champions in Vienna and Paris and all of that. It was fantastic. It was great. So from that experience, and I did train hard and I did my best. I put a lot of effort into it, and I pushed myself hard, as Eamon suggests you need to do. So I've never had any radical challenge to stay interested in exercise, and I really do try to recommend it as much as I possibly can to anybody who's been given a diagnosis of dementia. The second combating technique is diet, which obviously Darina has been talking in great detail about. And my hobby horse moment here is that this is my theory. There's lots of theories about diet, folks, lots of them. But my theory is that wheat and cereal is overeaten in our diets. And it doesn't suit our systems so well to be that dependent on it. And that our bodies do in fact require protein more. And we certainly do require fat, some fat. And as already pointed out, the brain seems to need fat in particular. So I do think that diet is hugely important to attend to if you're living with the condition or if you're caring for somebody with the condition. Hope for the future. That was the last bit of the mantra. And this is probably the big one, because I might have been a bit slow on the uptake on this, but it took a while for me to fully appreciate that hope is nothing other than a decision. You decide to hope. It doesn't light on you from afar. It's not a gift. You have to decide to hope, and you have to decide then to hope again and again and decide again. And you have to remake and remake that decision constantly. So that is what I do. And there is, in my view, reason to hope. It's a rational hope. It's not certain, but rational. Progress is being made. Those men and women in the white coats sweating away in laboratories or poring over research data are inching forward. And I feel that those research efforts will deliver. I believe we're on the cusp of that. I understand that one can be on the cusp of that for an indefinite period of time, but I just feel it is going to happen. So I apply that mantra, prepare for the probable, work for the possible, and hope for the future to my life in order to have a positive response to the diagnosis. And I do feel that that has helped me greatly, and I just try to share this with other people to see if it would work for them as well. I've been able to continue my professional work. That isn't always the case for somebody who has a diagnosis of early onset dementia. They can often be dismissed from work on that grounds alone. Partnership law doesn't help there in the likes of accountancy firms and solicitors firms, where every partner is responsible and liable to the work of every other partner. So I can see a problem, but it's not insuperable, and there should be ways and means found in which it can be overcome. I work in the arts world where eccentricity and difference are not just tolerated, but actually looked for. So, when I said I have an early dementia diagnosis, the response from all the people I contract with was, well, look, we'll keep an eye on it and see if it starts going wrong, we'll let you know. So, that's fortunate and lucky. I do feel I need to make that bit more of an effort to achieve the same work output as I did, but I am, of course, watching myself like a self-obsessed hawk, looking for the slightest sign of dysfunction and adding an additional layer of stress to the stress applying to the job itself. And I suppose stress is probably not going to be helping slow the beast's progression. However, whatever about my personal experience, what I do feel very strongly about is advocating for the larger profile of the illness to be known and understood. The typical cliched image of the elderly person languishing in the nursing home, sinking into a decline, is very, very far from the whole picture. There are significant cohorts of people with early stage dementia who are dealing well with it, living well with dementia. And for them, it's a very minimal and manageable manifestation that does not have to disrupt the substance of their lives immediately. They can and should be supported through this period, allowed to continue their lives, and not excluded from society, not ostracized or avoided out of ill-placed embarrassment. The disease is a moving target. Actually, it's worse. It's a moving target that changes as it moves. It's a challenging situation of real complexity. It's not a one-size-fits-all. But openness and alertness can certainly help the process. People don't have to be afraid of it and don't have to be awkward about it. I make sense of it calling it an acquired progressive disability. It arrives and currently it tends to progress. In its early stages, it's very thin, it's like a wedge, and it doesn't have much impact, and it's not a reason to declare your life over. It's really important that the public in general get to feel more comfortable about dealing with it, hear more about it, get less afraid of it, because there is a lot of fear, which can so easily lead to a stigma attaching to it, and the heaping of even more pain and suffering onto the burden of patients and carers. And here's a confession for the evening. The advocacy work I do, in fact, makes me feel better. It's not about altruism. Given that I have the condition, it actually makes me feel better to wrench some good from a bad thing. So returning to the purely first-person perspective, here for what it might contribute to the discussion is this. It has a kind of duality. Firstly, in the personal dimension, I accept my diagnosis and I work with it. I take recommended medication, but I also adopt what I regard to be effective and important lifestyle changes of diet, exercise, and meditation. I also hope a conscious, deliberate decision to remain optimistic of medical advances in the near future. And in the public dimension, in the social sphere, I unhesitatingly and freely ask for compassion and understanding. But at one and the same moment, and without shame, I don't hesitate to demand my basic human rights to respect and dignity, irrespective of the condition. I know all of you are here because you're interested in learning somewhat more about the condition and what it means to live with it. I hope you might then help to show others that stigma, fear, and avoidance have absolutely no useful role to play in helping people live well with the condition. Thank you.